Can everyone hear okay? Yeah, audio? Yeah. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges as a founder, secondly as a technical founder, and later on a bit more as a open source founder, more specific problems around that. My name is Martin McKeaveney. I'm the co-founder and CTO of a open source local platform called Buddies. Yes, Buddies is a platform that allows IT teams and development teams to build internal tools much faster and much easier than ever before. Using the Visual Builder, you can create admin panels, dashboards, product tools, connecting to 20, 30 plus more data sources, and scale them much more easily than you would if you were just writing with code. The real essence of Buddies is to convert data into applications. So connect to Postgres, SQL, DynamoDB, REST APIs, different sources to create applications from them. So you can connect to a Postgres database, for example, and almost generate an application from it in minutes rather than in weeks of development time with the team developers. So originally my background is in engineering. I worked as a web developer, mobile developer, a DevOps, in data engineering, data pipelines on both the front end and back end. And one of the most immediate problems that we always have to solve is this need to build internal. We built them for marketing, for product, internally, for engineering, for sales teams. And it was something that we had to just build. The company, the more of a problem this is, and having worked in large enterprise companies and small startups, this kind of thing is a really prevalent problem. So co-founders back home in Ireland a couple of years ago, and they told me a bit about the way they wanted to try and solve this problem with this visual builder. It was going to be open source, and it needed to be extensible to avoid that vendor lock-in and make it as a viable choice as possible for these companies. We all started working on the product full time about 2 or 3 years ago, and we raised a small pre-seed round, and we've raised a couple of rounds since that. Since then, we've got around 20 employees. We've got 40,000 companies using Buddybase in production, both in the cloud and self-host. And you can see some examples of those there. Companies like American Express, Google, Netflix, Disney, and Microsoft, and many, many more. We're also one of the fastest growing open source projects in the world, with over 15,000 GitHub stars, and it's rapidly growing from there. We're in the top 500,000 top 500 GitHub repos in the world. So the first big problem as a founder more generally is like understanding the problem, right? The problem you're trying to solve, and ultimately who for. I think one of the best ways to look at this is trying to think of a story that makes sense. And in our case, for our particular company, we started to think about things from a high level, as is detailed in this point first here. More software is being built than ever before. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that point, right? And many companies have this backlog of internal tools that they need to build. That's never getting any shorter. They always need more software. You can essentially solve more and more problems with software these days, and as a result, these internal tool backlogs are just growing. It's also becoming, at the same time, more difficult to retain developer talent. There's so much opportunity out there, there's so much good tech, and especially in these companies that you would deem to be, I guess, non-technically advanced or non-software companies, they find it extremely hard to hold on to their best technical talent. They lose them to sexy startups and companies that are doing things that are much more much more technologically enjoyable and advanced for the development talent that they have. They need a faster and more standardized way to build these types of tools, and they need it to be relatively future-proof. They don't want to have to rewrite it and move to something else in a fairly short period of time. And if it's going to be a sort of global standard and used by lots of teams all over the world in different sizes of companies, it stands to reason that it's open source. The second one, closely related, and one of the other big challenges is building that kind of minimum viable product and taking those first steps into building your product. For this, it's really about thinking what is the simplest possible thing that can work, that the product must have to solve that problem that I detailed earlier, and someone can use in a real life scenario in production. It also shouldn't take forever to build. You need to move pretty rapidly and get something out there, so you can start to learn faster. And then one of the most important points, I think, is this best in class versus acceptable. And what that really means is, what does your product need to have that is acceptable, and what does it need to have to be best in class and product defining? For example, if you were building some kind of e-commerce platform for furniture, for example, there's certain features that need to be acceptable, like obviously you need to have a checkout, you need to be able to search for products and list the products and things like that. If you don't have that, users will be surprised. But you might have some kind of AR experience to show the furniture in someone's house. That's one of those things that kind of falls into best in class. Like, you need to build something particularly special to make your product stand out and make it what it is. The next thing is really choosing technologies for these, for the MVPs, for the stack, what you're actually going to build. And the way I like to think about this is really that sweet spot between what you know and are most productive with, and what is popular and what is mature and what has a large ecosystem. Picking more flexible, mature technologies is almost always the right choice. It's easier to hire for, it's easier to find examples of people who have ran it at scale. It's much easier to build these types of products with mature technologies. The counter argument to that is, if your product really requires something more obscure, like maybe it's a slightly more obscure database, for example, it's probably okay to choose that if you absolutely need it. And you can kind of almost hire from smaller communities who are very passionate about that particular fringe technology, and they would love to work on it full time. So it can be a benefit if that technology is particularly relevant to the type of product that you're pulling. But in 99% of the cases, sticking to those defaults is a better choice. For us, particularly in our company, in Bodybase, one of the big challenges we have with technologies is the fact that we run both in the cloud and in self-host. So people can run Bodybase on their own machines through Docker, through bare metal, through Kubernetes, and then we have our cloud-hosted platform on AWS. And one of the things is that we can't really lean too heavily on proprietary technologies, things like Amazon SQS, and then have something else in the self-hosted setup, because we kind of have to write a connector that runs the same code kind of twice. So we have almost two versions of the code. So to maintain one code base, we tend to lean on these more open source technologies, things like Bool instead, and then run that in both environments. So it saves us having to kind of build things twice using two different types of technologies, just because they're proprietary. Another big one, and probably the biggest one for me, to be honest, is hiring. Team quality is everything. Who you hire, who's in your team. And it's easy to find people, it's easy to get large lists of candidates, and especially tech jobs who people will apply to, and it's okay to find big lists of people, but what's extremely difficult is to find the right people, not just from a skills perspective, but also from a culture perspective and everything else. So it's a very, very hard thing to do. Why? As I mentioned earlier, it's extremely competitive. There's a lot of good companies out there, there's a lot of good tech being built, and the best talent is hard to find and hard to retain. Mistakes are very costly. If you make a bad hire, you have to go back into that process again, and it's just not a very good experience. Admin work, things like legal, paperwork, visas, and remote workers. And for us, we actually handled quite a lot of this with remote.com. Shout out to Marcelo there, but it makes things a lot easier. Also, it's not for everyone. Like, talent alone does not make it. Like, if someone's a fantastic marketer or salesperson or programmer, and they've worked at a very large company, for example, they may not gel very well with a smaller startup with different processes. And so it's finding that person that ticks all those boxes can be hard for a company of that scale. It takes time. Interviews, sourcing, obviously takes a long time to do. Interviews around 1 hour, 2 hour, maybe more for several candidates. It's a time sink sometimes. And finally, new roles, like introducing new roles into the org. If you hire your first designer, your first salesperson, to find where they fit in the organization and getting processes up and running around that can be a challenge as well. Next one, if you hire a bunch of people, obviously you want them to execute and do their job well and push the company forward, and that's not easy either. These are the kind of high-level parts of a company. Obviously, there are more than that, but these are a lot of the ones people tend to think about, off the top of their head. So, for example, it all has to work. Like you can't have, as a technical founder, a lot of people think it's all product. If I build a fantastic product and I have the best engineering, then it's all going to be fine. It all has to work. You have to have great marketing, you have to have a great product, and you have to have a great sales motion, and ultimately support as well. As these customers come on, you need to support them and make sure that they get what they need. And it's just one of the most important things. And for example, if you spend all of your time just building features so you can market it and everyone knows about it, you're going to build up a lot of technical debt and effort that you're neglecting. They're going to use your product and it's not going to work. It's going to be full of bugs, for example. If you spend all your time on technical debt and building a fantastic infrastructure and all that, but not actually shipping any features, then there's nothing to market, right? It's just, you've got this incredible engineering, but you haven't actually built anything of note, and it's not a very competitive product. Communication, who needs to know what? Another huge challenge. There's three things mainly: why you're doing what you're doing, things like company strategies, why are we actually even showing up to work today, right? That sort of thing. What, the description of the things that you're actually going to do, things like roadmaps or sprint boards, decisions, those kinds of documents. And finally, how, things like product specs, architecture, docs, sales playbooks, marketing playbooks, and ultimately the kind of purest form of implementation really is code, right? Not the actual product in a lot of cases. And one of the big ways to combat this, I think, and to mitigate it really, is having a culture of writing within an organization. I think it's super important not just to hire great salespeople, marketers, engineers, but to hire good writers as well, people who can convey their thoughts in a clear and concise way through writing. They write documentation, they write about what they're doing, they are able to share that with the team, especially as a remote team. That's extremely important. You don't have that kind of face-to-face every day, and you have to lean on that a lot more. And when it's done well, I think it makes an enormous difference. It's a very important cultural thing to have inside a company. And finally, some of the more specific challenges around open source. So first of all, why open source? Why even go open source at all? And for us, more specifically, it was about building an ecosystem of internal tools rather than just a specific product to create them. So for us, things like extensibility were extremely important. Being able to extend the platform and not have that kind of vendor lock-in. It builds components, data sources, and things like that on top of the product. And if you can see the code of the core, that makes a lot of difference to authors who are building and extending the platform. Distribution, it's open source, you get a lot for free. You can take and run and get a lot of value out of the open source product in production, and as a result you can build a pretty large user base and a pretty large distribution very quickly. Security, self-hosting, security from the point of view that open source projects have almost a free security team kind of looking at issues. Like you get security researchers who reach out to you and will highlight issues in the code, and we also do security audits and things that become very easier because they have access to all the code just live on GitHub. But also the self-hosting aspect, being able to read the code and run it inside your own network, you take away a huge amount of vulnerabilities out of the box because you're just running it inside your own network and it's not connected to the internet. Secondly, connections to other open source tools. As I mentioned earlier, connections to things like Postgres, MySQL, REST APIs, these kind of tools. If we're connecting to open source tools, it makes sense that core is open source, and we're not, whenever we're building extensions, People don't have to ask us to see what the core looks like, and we don't have to rely super massively on documenting absolutely every part of it and maintaining that. Procurement is a massive thing as well. Certainly in large enterprise companies, you can get things up and running a lot faster in massive enterprises because the code's open and it ticks a lot of boxes for them. If it's not, you have to go through a lot more steps. You have to share stuff with them, fill out a lot more forms, paperwork, and it generally slows the whole process down. Procurement's so much easier with an open source product, and there are various companies we've spoken to who actually won't touch certain products if they're not open source. We're seeing a real tilt towards preference for some of these tools, especially in the dev tools kind of infra space. You get amazing feedback loop. Obviously that's huge distribution. It allows people to come on, comment, provide feedback, and tell you what they think of the product. So you get that huge amount of feedback much easier, which is great to obviously develop and improve your product. Avoid vendor lock-in, talked about a little bit. People want to know if you go away, can they still pull it down and use it? And you won't shut down the whole service, and they'll never have access to the code or the software. With open source, provides that longevity. There's a lot more people involved in terms of the community, and the project can continue even if we were to go away tomorrow. And again, on the data sources and components point, we allowing contributions from the community. We've had a huge amount of community members build lots of connectors for our product, and it's not just relying completely on the internal team. You have literally a group of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of developers out there who can contribute and help you build your product, especially when it's a case of just writing like a single connector or a single component, and it keeps that workload a bit smaller and makes people more likely to contribute. With any open source product, there's really three kind of big stages and big challenges. First of which is this kind of project community fit, which is you put something out there and people are finding it interesting, they're starring in GitHub, they're interacting with the community, and what that tells you is that people think it's really cool what you're building and what your plans are, which is fine, but it doesn't necessarily translate into usage, people actually downloading it and using it. And that's the next stage. Very well known term around product market fit, and you can measure this through downloads, usage, product metrics. If you're using something like Post-Hog or Amplitude or Pendo or whatever, you can start to collect some of this data and understand what users are doing and how much value they're getting out of the product. There's also a qualitative element to that too, where you can interview and speak to customers and find out what their needs are. And the final one then is this value market fit. So you might have 1 billion people using your product and they love it, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're paying you for it. So that's converting this usage into revenue through a sales motion. So when it comes to some of the more specific challenges here, mainly around the last one, around that value market fit and monetizing the open source side of things. Open source, and I kind of put this at the top here, does not mean free. I think a lot of people think that. You get people in the community, and I think everyone's perception of what open source is can be very different. And as a result, you can have low quality feedback and slightly aggressive community members who are like, you asking me for money? Well, no, I didn't think that's how this worked, right? And that can be a challenge. But the real, some of the big examples here, like on the right hand side, there's a couple of different models to go, to monetize open source projects. The top one is a lot closer to what we are doing, open core. You have a very generous core, and you can use the product pretty much in production. But as you scale and you need more features to use it at scale, you will pay for those features. GitLab's a really good example of this, and they've done it very successfully. Next one's support, where people use the product, they need support, they need someone on the other end of the phone. Red Hat Linux is probably the de facto example of this, where basically your entire business is built on that, and it's many billions of dollars. And finally SaaS, so they build a cloud-based product off the back of the open source core. Elastic and MongoDB are examples of this, so everyone's probably heard of or used MongoDB to some degree, and same with Elastic too, but they've built these cloud-based products for things like application performance monitoring, for for metrics, for improved search, and they handle all the hosting and scaling for you, and that's what you pay for in more of a usage-based model. And deciding between those sort of open source versus paid features is one of the biggest balances ever, because you don't want to paywall everything because you'll alienate your community, right? People will go, oh, what's the point in me using this when I can use something else that gives me more for free? And also, you want to make money, so you have to paywall some features, and finding that balance between what is paid and what is not is a big challenge for any commercial open source project. Next one, which is actually one I noted as an advantage in one of the previous slides, is you get these nice security researchers and consultants who will help you find vulnerabilities in your code, and it's a bit easier for them to find it because it's open source, but at the same time you've also people who aren't so nice, right? And they'll read your code and they'll try and exploit that for their own gain. So it can also be a downside, and things that were hidden through obscurity before might not be because the code's open. And finally, closely related to the free versus paid is pricing. If you give away a lot for free and you want to keep that core relatively open and people are using it in production, it can be quite hard to price your product in a nice way where it maps directly to the value. For us, for example, because we run cloud and also in self-hosted, there's slightly different pricing models between those two things, and you've kind of got double the pricing models almost, because you've got 3 or 4 tiers in cloud and 3 or 4 tiers in self-host. And the open source tier, as I said, is relatively generous, but what those next tiers look like and that first kind of step for someone to pay can be difficult to understand kind of where those points are. Certainly for an open source project, I think it's a lot more challenging. But pricing in general, whether it's proprietary or not, is extremely difficult to get right, and it's always changing. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Does anyone got any questions for Martin before we go to the next one? Yeah, we've got one over there.
You say you've got a kind of community contributing a lot. Do you have any issues with them needing to assign copyright for their contributions with your sort of contribution license agreement?
Yeah, so whenever a contributor makes a contribution, we get them to sign like a CLA as part of it, and only if they sign that, then will it ever get merged. So that kind of solves that problem for us.
Yeah, so people have been happy to do this for you.
Yeah, they generally are. A lot of people who contribute, it's usually to scratch their own itch to a certain degree. They'll find a problem where they want, as I mentioned, those connectors and data sources. And I'd say, oh, I'm using this weird database at work and I need a connector for that, so they write it and then they'll contribute it back into the code.
Okay, so I think it's a bit of a dumb question, but what's to stop other people from hosting your code and providing it as a cloud service?
Yeah,
that's a license.
Yeah, so all our code is copyleft. So basically, we have if you take the code and you go and run it, you have to make that code open source. If you're to change it in any way, then you have to make that code open source as well. Now, that doesn't particularly stop someone from actually taking it and going to host it. We can't actually prevent that with our particular license, but one example of that actually, I talked there around Elastic and MongoDB. They did this, they changed their license because originally, I can't even remember what their old license was, but they changed it to prevent that because basically Amazon came and just hosted it and made an enormous amount of money from it. Redis was another example. They changed it, they had a different license because Amazon was paying them nothing, right? And they just were making millions of dollars off the back of their technology. So in our case, I think that we're not particularly worried about someone hosting it. The real value is in the product itself and the community around it, building those data sources and connectors. And also there's a very large support element in there as well with big companies running at scale.
Do you have people, is the community active? Like do you have people contributing to your code, like creating a free code for you, free connectors?
Yeah, we've had quite a few up to this point. We've had people build probably about 10, 15 connectors for the platform. We had the community take a fairly big part in building like SSO authentication and a bunch of other like components and things like that. And more recently, we kind of leaned into that a lot more and gave people the tools they needed to go and build these things themselves, like a better like developer experience around that. And since then, we've seen like a lot of repos pop up around GitHub, people building components so they can build directly into the platform. So it's cool to see.
One more. Last one.
I don't know if I missed the word, but you started as open source or you migrated to open source? And if you started as open source, what made you choose between, okay, I'm going to start doing my code and then making it open source, or starting from scratch now?
Yeah, we started from scratch, open source. So we built, we started off in that repo and just started building out. And at the very start, the product was terrible, right? There was nothing there. So we built that, and we had maybe like 20 or 30 GitHub stars, and then we started to sort of get somewhere with the product. We did a few big sort of marketing campaigns around the features that we built, and then since then it sort of caught like the GitHub trending, and it was just like thousand after thousand after that. It was after that, and then we had some of those like big companies use it that you saw on the slides there, and from there it's kind of gone from strength to strength, because sometimes you sort of trend on GitHub and you get a lot of stars from that and stuff. But yeah, it's always been open source. We've always worked in the open.
Cheers, Martin. Thank you for that. Cheers.
Thanks, man.
So, 1 second. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so now for keynote speaker, thank you for taking the time out, Marcelo. I know you must be very busy. Marcelo, founder of remote.com.
If you're waiting for more slides, that's it. I literally have nothing else. So, my name is Marcelo. I'm CEO and co-founder of Remote. In a nutshell, what we do is we allow companies to hire people in many locations, right? So that you don't have to go through the hustle of opening a company. So we do it for you. And we take care of all the payroll and stuff. That's it in a nutshell. Now, onto the more pragmatical parts and what we do and who we are. We're about 1,000 people. We don't have an office. We're highly internally distributed in over 100 countries, I believe, at this point. And that's it. We're 3.5 years old as a company. And we've been valued at about 3 billion, whatever that means, to be honest. No one cares. All I can do here today is essentially, reinforce all that Martin said. It's pretty much as best as advice as I can give you. But I can also, talk to you about the things that I've done, the things that we've done, things that we've achieved, and also, honestly, the things that you should avoid. I can't tell you for a fact what to do, because you're going to have to figure it out for yourself. But I can tell you what doesn't work, and what you have to look for. So ultimately, we started Remote in January 2019. My co-founder and I. So Job was the CEO, I'm COO. He used to be the VP of product at GitLab. We knew we wanted to solve the problem of remote workers. Not just having freelancers across the world, having proper employees, properly employed with benefits, with all that, as simple as humanly possible. But it is a really big challenge. Right? We knew from the get-go, but it fundamentally is a game of bringing boring stuff, like payroll, like stuff that is for most engineers something that is mostly happen in spreadsheets into automation world. Ultimately, things like payroll or benefits, healthcare, whatever you name it, onboarding someone in a country, registering social security. It's something that's been going on for ages, right? It's centuries old. So ultimately, you need to tackle it somehow. And for us, it was essentially creating this sense of almost an Iron Man suit around, all these processes. They're super old. Some of them are outdated too. And the way we started building our company, the first things to do is you're trying to build a team, right? We never had specific limitations about where to hire. We hired globally from day one, and we never had any target. We always look into our own budgets, what we could afford, the people we could hire, the technical skills, and what they could bring to the team. More important to us, and to be able to scale how we did and to survive as a company, because the first years you're going to wrestle literally everything and everyone to get whatever you need to be done and shipped on time. You have to lay down the laws and the things that you need to work on, so that's a bit of like a foundation of a house. Whatever you set in stone early days is going to scale. If you build shit, you're going to scale shit. That's easy. It's also fairly, the balance, as Martin was saying. You get to a point where you think that you have to be in the middle and sort of leverage, the speed with which you're going to ship things or build a team or whatever, and how well you do it. And if you take your sweet time to do it, you're not going to ever get to do it, right? And if you're too fast, then you're just going to, do garbage. That's essentially it. In terms of the things, as I was building, I'm an engineer by trade. I started for a year and a half as CTO. I've been a VP of engineering in the past as well, and CTO a couple of times. And later on, I took this role of COO more to, start rebuilding a lot of things that the market thought as, standards in across the world, and I wanted to do it on my own. And as a co-founder and being highly, an anxious person and very, stubborn, I wanted to do my way. But when we started this, I was just an engineer. Essentially, I was building code in my very happy place all day long, working from my house, and that was it. We had it was me and my co-founder hacking code all day long for a long while. But it comes a time where you have to build, and you have to start having a team, build a team, plan the future slightly. A few things I learned across the, if you want to play the building game in which you're going to build a team for months or years to come, a few things are really tough from the get-go. As I built many teams in the past, one thing I have to admit they've never been able to solve, and that's diversity. It's very easy, especially in tech, and you build a team that everyone looks like usually white men, 20s, and that's it. It's a big issue. It's a fundamental big issue because you're essentially getting clones of yourself, and ultimately, in a team that everyone looks the same, the output will always be the same because you're influenced by the approximately similar cultural circumstances. And that was, to me, one of the things that stubborn as I am, I wanted to make sure I would not fall into that trap again. It took us a really long while, but the ultimate truth behind it is that it's a very, very rigged game. If you try to create a team that you have enough diversity of backgrounds, of gender, of the country of origin, whatever, you'll soon realize that the pool, if you go on Twitter, on LinkedIn, the first hits are always going to be the same people, always, right? Because our whole social network and group of friends are typically influenced by the same people, right? They follow the same people. So it takes a lot more than what you think you're going to put into it. Quite a lot more. And it's simple things as if you think, well, I'm going to hire someone in whatever country. We're making several assumptions that in many countries you have internet as fast as you have it in whatever country you're in, especially in, for instance, Portugal, UK, United States. That's not the case. There are many countries where, and people that have great tech skills where if it rains a bit harder, internet goes boom. Right? And building a synchronous, fully distributed team is a lot more than, just hiring people on we work remotely or whatever else. You have to be quite deliberate about it. And when you think through, building a long-lasting business, you're going to multiply your odds of success if you think through and look for the unknowns. What you don't know that you don't know. And ultimately, in all things that we started tackling, diversity was one of the things that until today, and to be honest, it's not a long time ago, 3.5 years, even though we're 1,000 people, to me it still feels like 50, because I don't leave my house, so I don't know most of the team, personally at least. I spend a lot of time with everyone, but only through Zoom. They only know me from this side up. When I meet someone, the first thing that they do is try to sneakily stand next to someone and see who's the tallest. It's one thing that happens. But you have to be quite deliberate with the team and the business that you're building. More on the engineering side, certain things I would, I looking back, I did instinctively because either they worked in the past or they really failed, and I didn't want to make the same mistake again. In terms of picking the technology you get to use, what matters is building what you want to sell. Customers, ultimately, they don't care. They really don't. I was going to be using another word, pull back. But no one gives a fuck. I'm sorry. That's the truth. You can be very proud. I'm an engineer. I was always very proud of my code. I try to apply all the things that I learned throughout the years, mistakes and whatnot. But ultimately, customers buy product. They really don't buy your lines of code. So the only thing to optimize here is whatever is going to help you get as far as possible, as fast as possible, without losing years of your life. Because there's always a trade-off in the technologies you use. From programming languages, some are super fast to evolve and to develop. 2 months in, you get wake-up calls at 2 a.m. every single day because something is down, right? And certain technologies, there are trade-offs. Others are quite the opposite. They run forever. They never fail. It takes 10 years to learn, right? You can't find enough people to hire. It takes a really long time and money to find people. So ultimately, find whatever works. The initial assessment that you have to make is more from the product side. So whatever you're going to do that's going to, propel you into the future as fast as possible, because that's the game you have to play. Now, you should always, fundamentally follow what you love. You shouldn't end up in a situation where you're using a technology just because someone tells you that you're going to build fast. You don't like it. You really, you don't get along with the community. It also makes no sense. Right? You have to find sort of a middle ground that enables you to, build as fast as possible, build a team around it, build a structure, both technical and human, that enables, the business. That's ultimately what the technology needs to do. Now, as a third item, something that I highlight is super critical. As Martin mentioned, and if you code and if you spend a lot of time coding, it's very easy for you to think, well, who cares about writing? Documentation is really something you do maybe in the 2000s, 1998 or something, which is quite untrue. And more, business run async. Right? Teams go remotely, work remotely, if not entirely, at least in a hybrid mode. Sometimes people are in the same office, but in different places. And if you think something is in your head and you're trying to put it down in code, it'll work. Maybe you don't even know how it works, but it does. You ship it, and it's kind of okay. But tomorrow, someone's going to have to fix it, right? Someone's going to have to improve it somehow. And the synchronous side of things as building an engineering team was honestly one of the best things the methodologies that we use. Our work is fundamentally asynchronous, but for that, we document a lot. Like, the first thing we do is to document whatever, be it a thought, how code runs, and you need to assume that even if someone is in the same room or same country or city, they may not be awake at the same time as you are. Maybe you like to work through the night, and that person, has a life actually. And you cannot make any assumptions. What if you get hit by a bus or your colleague? So ultimately, you end up in a situation where you're going to spend a lot more money and time to unravel something. In our case, we had one of the teams is still amazing, where we have someone in Portugal, the other person is in Kyrgyzstan, and the other person is in India. So, and actually now they have a team member in Australia. So, if you're depending on the synchronous side of things, on spreading the word and waiting for the other person to tell them, what it does, you're screwed, right? Because you're fundamentally wasting time waiting. So the tenets of asynchronous work are essentially that: don't wait, right? And the only way you have to not wait is to document really well yourself, and then get going, right? You apply this technique that is known in computer science as multiplexing, where you divide your work into multiple chunks and you parallelize as much as possible, and you run as fast as possible. Some things were going to be sequential, the other ones were not. But with this, you get a high degree of freedom, and ultimately, everyone's happy. With an added advantage that if you really have to wait, then you can spend time doing the things that you really like. Maybe tackling some technical debt, or writing some tests, whatever that is. And as we build a team across time, we had always a mantra. First, we build something that works. If you really need to, you make it fast. If you really, really need to, you make it beautiful. Because if you build something that doesn't work, then who cares? Customers are not going to pay for it. If you need it to be fast, sometimes you don't. And most of the time, you really don't need to waste time on making it fast, right? So you can ship it and then iterate, either make it later faster. If it's a precondition, then you make it fast. And then also, of course, engineers will over-engineer, right? We like to make things beautiful. We like to spruce it up a bit more and make, one thing that I learned when I was learning to code was try to make code that you don't have to apologize for, because you're going to have to explain to someone in your store by saying, I could have done better, but I really could. So ultimately, if you really need to, make it beautiful, right? We've kept it super simple. We don't use sprints. We don't use agile methodologies. We don't use Scrum. Our engineering team is about 200 people, give or take. And up until this day, we never had a sprint or something similar. What we do is a continuous flow of work where everyone's independent in a way. The work, typically you assume what you don't assume, and you discuss what needs to be built, either with a product manager or someone that your team is working with. You spec it out. We use GitLab a lot. We use the cars as tickets, whatever you use it, Trello or something similar. And then you run with it. There's a sort of a Kanban board. You pick up whatever's in top. You run with it. When it's done, rinse and repeat. And that's it. We keep shipping. And we make it work super easily. And I think the trick behind it all is because it's simple. So you don't end up in meetings to discuss anything. We try to avoid meetings as much as possible. You document. You don't wait. If you get stuck in something, you pick something else, you can get going. And ideally, when it's shipped, then you go back and you pick whatever else is at the top as a priority. And ultimately, you create this sense of really continuous flow. Right? Ideally, one of the things that I learned throughout my years is that a lot of teams or companies, they start off with this idea of, I have to have sprints, I have to have this methodology, I have to implement this, I read it in a blog post, it's fundamental, I'm gonna die, the whole thing's gonna get doomed if we don't do it. And it's like taking a pill without having any issues, right? All processes and methodologies that you use on a day-to-day basis they need to serve and solve a problem. If you don't have a problem, don't solve anything. Don't apply something that you don't need. And often, you know, as engineers, we try to expect certain things to happen, and so you try to cope with things before they happen, and try to, and in many cases it's well served, but also in many, many cases it's not. So it's important to understand that simplicity holds, you know, excellent execution. There's always going to be assumptions. You always go through, you know, should I be doing this? Should we be discussing that? Should I wait for someone to approve what I'm doing? Often it's best to just say you're sorry, then ask for permission. Right? And of course, there are many circumstances where you can't, because you're going to break all customers, or you're going to do something. It's important to understand how you measure risk, but odds are, and I'm going to say like 80-90% of the cases, you'll be fine. And it's important that you learn through things and you keep evaluating the processes you go through, the things you've learned after you went through it, but keep it simple. And that's fundamentally it. There's literally nothing more to it. Like we have 1,000 people in a company. Everyone interacts with our product. Our platform is the first thing always top of mind, because otherwise it will just go and manual work, and that's not any fun. And so ultimately, you have to be highly pragmatic about the things you do and the things you ship. And, you know, as a sort of a last piece of advice, hyper prioritization is again also a lot about simplicity. But even in the way that you tackle code, you tackle your, you know, the things that you decide to build as you're shipping things, as you're addressing the product, as you're discussing the design or marketing or sales, there's so much you can do, always, at the time. At any given moment, there is so much you can do. So when you think that, okay, I have this amount of stuff to do, you can't do it all. Most of the cases, you cannot do it all. So if you think through, what am I going to prioritize and ship fast? Because when you ship something small, it will work. If you decide to ship something big, ultimately, a lot of people will wait for you to ship until something is big. And I can tell you the certain degree of certainty of 99.90%. It's gonna be shit, you know, because the first thing that's gonna come out is, you know, whatever's going on through your brain, which is not typically what people want. And then you have these discussions where the engineer builds something, the designer didn't design, the designer is frustrated, the product manager asked for something that the designer didn't get, the engineer didn't build. All of a sudden there's all this shit going on, and you wasted weeks. And so the importance of hyper-prioritization is about finding simplicity and the smallest piece of working code that you can ship. We typically call it a minimum viable change. What is the smallest piece of change that you can ship and make that is going to bring the biggest impact, you know, into the product, and it actually works. You know, if it's just saying changing the color of a font, maybe it's going to work. But if it's something, if you're working through something big, and you look at this really big task, and you're like, oh my God, it's going to hurt. You know, it's because you're not simplifying it. You're trying to tackle way too many things. So it's always a lot better to ship something small, but that works, than to wait for the perfect thing at the end of the day, and nothing is shipped, nothing works. You have good intentions, the company's going to die, you're going to keep your good intentions, and that's about it, right? And look, many years going through this kind of motion, or I've built many teams, engineering teams, product, and you know, now also operational. It's always the same motion. Year after year, team after team, company after company, the motions are exactly the same. You know, if I keep you, if I'm gonna let you with something is, keep it simple, whatever works. That's it. I hope you like my slides. answer any questions if you have. Yeah.
What governance do you put around like communication?
What governance?
As Notion or anything?
Yeah, we use Notion fundamentally for what we call product mechanics. We actually separate these into almost 3 parts. So one is pure product. Typically, pure product, of course, you have to make sure that product managers, designers, someone from sales or business, they have what they ask for, and then the next person is going to come in, they know what it does, right? If it's about a feature, it needs to be well documented. Second is what we typically call product mechanics, which is the assumptions that went into building the product. So let's imagine that you have 3 types of users in the platform, all of them with a subtype or something. Those, at some point, will need to be analyzed. Someone from data is going to want to look into the business, is going to want to know the distribution, for instance, but they will not know what to ask for if it's not documented, or what it means. Especially because we have, engineers have this great tendency for naming things. And so you have like the user admin who is also master ninja and a subtype Jedi. Now, for the person that built it, it's very clear what that person does, right? It's going to rule the whole platform. From someone from BI or BizOps, so it means nothing. And then the third step, you have pure technical decisions. If we make a decision around going into TypeScript, we use Elixir as code backend and React as front end. Certain decisions in architecture, for instance, we make sure that they're well documented. And then if you have things that need to be within the code base, because we're hosted on GitLab, we also ship it aggressively into. Elixir has a great documentation tool, so it's good, to use that well. It's very, very, lively, let's say. But more than that, it's the attitude around it, because the team, in our case, the company, everyone demands, because it's basics, right? If you work purely distributed and asynchronously, you wake up, you have your cup of coffee, you go to the gym, run 10 kilometers, come in, go to the gym again, you do that whole avocado thing and whatnot, and then you start working, right? And the first thing you're gonna do is, all right, where did I leave yesterday? Or I need to pick up something from someone else. If you don't have it, and that person is like in a different time zone, 12 hours ahead of you, the person is sleeping, right? You're not gonna sit around on your ass all day. And so that is part, and so it's almost at this point felt as sort of work etiquette. Like if you don't do it, you suck. But it is not a given. It took us a while at the beginning to reinforce the idea that this is not optional. It's part of your job as well. Yeah?
How open are you to co-creating your products with another company where that will get added to your product, what you call variety, whereas it will still help the other company partner with you? So it will be a long-term partnership or strategic partnership, for example. And how do you get beyond the sales guys to reach the team that will actually be, where you can discuss partnerships?
All our work is internal from the engineering standpoint, because it is highly coupled with our IP in a way, with the way we run our business. And so having, having worked in the business for a few years, understanding that to build this kind of business, anything extra, as communication layer, will detract more than it will add. And so for our business case specifically, we always avoided it. Unless, the only way we have an API with which we work with customers that integrate with us, and of course we have a team for integrations that works with all these partnerships. It's all fair. It's part of the integration. But internally, we always kept it closed because it's part of our IP. Opening it up has a tremendous amount of, even from a training standpoint, the complexity makes it so that it hardly is a business case to be able to spend some time and employ more people, and because of the way we constructed the business to run, it would not make sense.
I would like to discuss this further with you, but maybe.
Yeah, better to email me. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for your talk. My name is Ben. I have a question. How do you make sure that your team is not over-engineering? Do you have some measurements on that, or do they have?
So even that, keeping it simple, to be honest. One of the things, being pragmatical, it is tough because it's always subjective, right? The initial team is always sort of the team that sets the tempo, that sets the wavelength in which the team operates going forward. Now, with a team of 200 people, a lot of that dilutes as part of work, and some people do like to over-engineer, right? But it is, as I said with documentation, is a recurrent reminding process about what matters. And because you have an oversimplified process, we don't have sprints. That means that we're not going to stop for a meeting to discuss what has been done in the past 2 weeks. Your teams, because we have very small teams, I don't like big teams, top 6 people, including a team leader. It's going to be very, very visible to everyone, right? And in itself surfaces super fast. Like, it is not about we don't attribute points but given that the team, most of the team, I'm going to say 80% of the team is building product, user-facing work, that surfaces very easily. And then over-engineering typically happens more from the internal core team that are working more on, inwards and the mechanics of all that. But the only way to flush that out is to create a culture of simplification within the team. I've been in many teams and cases where you apply strategies of evaluating points, estimates. At remote, I've always been against setting deadlines because, look, if any human was good at predicting the future, none of us would be here. Either we'd all be rich or dead, or both. And so I've always been quite against, deadlines of, I'm going to build this feature in 2 months, 2 weeks. That in itself is wrong. Like, the idea that you should have is like, I'm going to do the best that I can, always. And then when you're tired, you step away and you breathe through that process. And it's better, and ultimately leads to less over-engineering. Because typically over-engineering comes from a fear of shipping something. Your own self-doubt, or wanting to do things over the top, make sure that they overscale or something. And don't get me wrong, it's good to be ahead of the curve so that you don't ship something and it breaks 2 days later. That's quite important. But ultimately, I have this rule where if something takes more than 2 weeks, it's already too long. And you should hash it out with someone within your team. And shipping, having the MVC in mind, reduces the cases where over-engineering happens. Because over-engineering is often is like a bit of a flu. If you expose yourself, it's going to happen. I'm speaking for myself. I remember spending, I had a time where before starting remote, I was, I took some weeks to transition from my previous job to start remote with my co-founder. And I believe I spent a month working on a single function. Just because I could. I was feeling happy. And at the end, I never used it. But that was it. But to your point, the anecdote of what I'm saying is, I never really had a customer to serve. And, having that purpose helped quite a lot. But at the end of the day, keeping it simple.
It sounds like a culture.
Yes.
It's a culture thing, it's not a framework, it's not a documentation or whatever, it's a culture.
I've learned, in my own experience, is that those frameworks, you're gonna, you get all these people in the front row, You're going to create a box for all of them, and I can tell you that you're going to limit their creativity, but what you're going to get is boxes. That's what you're going to get. Maybe the first person is a triangle. They're going to turn into a box. That's what you're going to get. And so frameworks are useful if you really have a problem and you desperately need to fix it.
I would say it's a culture over process. Right?
Absolutely. All the time.
I have more questions.
One more, maybe. Last one, I think.
My question is, when, as a co-founder, when you started your company, at what point did you decide it's time to hire employee number one? And which was this role that you were like, we need to get an external person who will be our first employee? Because from my understanding, you were two co-founders in the beginning, so, and you were both technically inclined?
I was technically
Yeah,
inclined.
so
My
like-
co-founder is just a curious person at best.
Yeah, so when you're building the company, what was that happened that you decided it's time for us to now hire the first employee, and for what role was that?
Yeah. So, as leaders in a company, I'm not going to say C-level because it means nothing. But as a co-founder, what I want first is that the company does good and does well for everyone. Secondly, your job as a manager, a leader, whatever situation in the hierarchy of the company, is to fire yourself and get someone better. Always, non-stop. And so, of course, the first time, first month or so, when we started remote, we knew that it's going to be big, and we would need people. But again, if you don't hyper-prioritize, if you don't simplify, you'll very easily could have just built, hire 20 people and start building. I would waste the time of all those 20 people. So essentially, you start going for yourself. You look for the things that you can do and you do well. When you realize that you're reaching your capacity, and if you can afford it, then you go for the person that can complement that. Right? If you're still in the game, and like as I was still an engineer, I needed someone to help me. I was handling the first people that I hired. I'm more of a back-end engineer / architect, and I was building quite a lot of the back end, trying a bit of the front end, but I suck at front end. And so we started building something fairly big. So I got someone to help me with the back end and front end as well, and then we kept going as we saw the need. For a long time, we tried to hire, and even still today, a bit ahead of the curve, so that you don't allocate more work than you have people, right? So otherwise, you're going to end up in a burnout. And as someone managing that work, you also have to understand where to draw the line, because if you don't, people working with you will also not draw that line and end up overworking.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.